Look, it's actually clean now. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. Room's clean because we had a guest speaker last week. We did record the lesson. It is recorded if you want to look at it on YouTube. Don't have to, but this morning we're going to look at I thought it was a pretty good title, Unorthodox Christianity, or Christianity as being an unorthodox religion, I should say, in the face or in the heart of Babylon. The Romans, I want to give a little bit of context. This is what I want to do with this lesson. I want to give some context for what we're going to jump into in the next couple months. We're going to be studying 1 Peter. And I want to give some context to that because the Romans had a lot of disdain for Christians. They believed that Christianity was more of a revolution than it was some sort of a practicing faith. And they thought the failures of their own empire were due in part to the practices of the Christians, or, to be more accurate, the lack of practice and practices that the Christians were not doing. They were not offering sacrifices to the gods, and therefore it was their fault when bad things happened. And if you can remember, I mentioned the name in the Bible class Nero. In 64 AD, a fire destroyed much of Rome. And trying to get out of the blame for that fire, Nero murdered a vast multitude of Christians and Jews and used them as scapegoats. He blamed it on them. And then again in the 3rd century, as we see the Roman Empire beginning to decline, ancient Rome, their economy was collapsing. This is before we get to Constantine in the 300s. Right? You had political chaos. You have militaries that are revolting, and there's this barbarian invasion coming as well. And it nearly destroys Rome. And again, Christians were blamed. And so Christians were seen as weird. They were seen as unorthodox in their religion. Speaking of unorthodoxy, anybody here ever been to Austin, Texas? What's the motto? Keep Austin weird. The same thing for Portland. They stole it from Austin. Keep Austin weird. And, in some sense, that's a playful sort of slogan. But for many people, it is a way of life there. And both my brothers live in Austin. That's how I know these things. The word conformity, when we get into that sort of crowd, that's a 4-letter word. That's a bad word for them. Austin likes to think of itself as this hub of individuality and expressionism and local art, as well as this weird lifestyle choices and activities. And for the most part, what I'm referring to when I say the hardcore crowd, that would be the people who are on 5th Street. 5th Street and 6th Street, downtown Austin. And for the most part, those folks don't like religion. They are anti-religion, especially organized religion like Christianity. And so this Keep Austin Weird crowd sees Christianity as the opposite of weird. It's normal. It's so normal, it's sickening, right? They see Christianity as adding nothing to society except some vestige of America's racist or sexist past, right? That's all they see Christianity as. And sometimes if we open our eyes, we can see maybe some of those things that they're talking about, right? Church, air quotes, right? Church can easily become something that's just, it's on the to-do list for this week, right? It's one thing that we can, if we need to, we can skip it pretty easily because it's just another place to go and consume content that we want to hear. It's just another place to go socialize or reinforce our cultural values, right? And even worse than that, though, Christianity, and I'm using that term broadly, can sometimes showcase and promote those things that the Keep Austin Weird crowd is accusing us of. Sometimes those things do happen. Sometimes Christianity, quote unquote, promotes some of Western culture or American culture's darkest evil doing. Greed, narcissism, extreme individualism, exploitation, nationalism, racism. Modern Christianity, again, I'm using that in a bigger sense, is not weird anymore. Right? It's not weird in the sense of that it's attractive or compelling. And that's because modern Christianity frequently is just religious papering over the top of political culture, popular culture. Right? I heard a great sermon illustration this week, and I fully admit that I'm stealing it, because it was such a great illustration. It's in a book. I've just bought the book, too. The book is called Strange Religion. Can you imagine where I got the title for today's lesson from? It was in that book, and it just hit right on the butt, right on the head. And so let me ask you a question. What color is coconut water? It's white or clear. Break up the coconut, comes out, it's white or clear, opaque, right? Somebody already knows where we're going with this. Yeah. Most people would say that it's white or clear, right? And if you crack up a coconut and pour it out, the water is initially white or clear, right? But if you leave it there, what will happen? Does anybody know? It turns pink. Yeah. Pink is what color, pink is normal. Pink is what color bottled coconut water should be. So why don't we have pink coconut water on our shelf? Because people won't drink it. You see where I'm going with this? Many mass-marketed coconut water producers use preservatives and other chemicals in there to maintain that pristine appearance, right? They know that their consumers, they associate clear with fresh and clean, right? And so ironically, they add these chemicals to make it seem more natural, right? By the way, I'm all for preservatives, don't get me wrong. But in this case, it's funny. But can you see where I'm going with this? If coconut water was supposed to be pink, and I'm being told that a manufactured version of it is supposed to make me feel better and be better for me, the question is, what else in life is supposed to be pink? What about Christianity? If we look at popular Christianity or the wider world, especially in our culture, in the Western world, popular Christianity, in my opinion, often reflects a chemically altered version of the Jesus movement that we find in the Bible. And it's been altered for cheap refreshment. It's religious papering over social norms. And it's not weird anymore because it's the norm. It's the social norm. So let's go back to the writing of the apostles and the other first century Christian leaders and see what the natural ingredients are in their religion, the way Christianity was founded, their faith, their way of being. Oh, I forgot to hit the button. All right. Well, we got to look at it for a few seconds. So let's back up and let's consider, we're talking about the Roman Empire. What constituted religion in ancient Rome, in the Roman Empire? Well, religion in ancient Rome was made up of two major parts. There was the imperial rituals, where they worshipped Caesar as a god, and that really began with Julius and Augustus Caesar. But also there were provincial religious practices, because if you'll notice, and if you remember your history class, the Roman gods were like 85% Greek gods with their name changed, right? So they would incorporate these provincial religious practices into their own faith. And these religious practices were followed both by the people of Rome, but also by those people who were conquered, right? The Romans thought of themselves as highly religious, believe it or not. And they even attributed their success and world power to their collective piety, to their collective religiousness. But mostly they attributed to maintaining good relations with the gods. And that is critical for how we need to understand how Christianity is different than religion in the Roman Empire and how it's different in our world today. You see, the Christians refused to worship those gods, right? And that act was seen as putting the entire empire in jeopardy. There were certain fundamentals of religion that the Christians just did not have, right? They didn't have material sacrifices. They didn't have physical temples. They didn't have formal priests. And those things were building blocks of religion in the first century. And if you showed up to a Christian gathering in the first century, you wouldn't find any of those things, right? That was weird. How was that possible? Well, the first Christians were not trying to be weird in order to be weird. I know a guy, I won't name his name, he's here in town. He wears a hat that has red hair. Nothing wrong with red hair. But I mean like yarn, like a clown coming out of it. And he wears it because we're supposed to be a peculiar people. So he takes a pun on that. That's not what the first Christians were trying to do. That's not what Paul is telling them to do in that verse either. First Christians were not trying to be weird in order to be weird. They weren't anti-conformists as in some sort of political or cultural ideology. That's not what's going on. In fact, as much as possible, they wanted to prove themselves to be respectable, good society members. It was more the case that the person of Christ, the work of the Spirit, and the fundamental work of the gospel, the good news message itself, changed their orientation, how they saw things in reference to God. God's world, his creatures, and his plan for humanity were all changed because of the work of Jesus and the gospel in their life. And that made Christians seem like they were aliens, right, from another planet. They had these unusual ways of talking about God. First of all, he was singular because there's only one. They talked about the divine very differently. They talked about spiritual matters very differently than their neighbors. And so these Christians had these odd patterns and practices of worship. Now, weird is not always bad, right? That's why my brothers live in Austin. They're not, hardcore keep it weird people. Weird can be good, but weird can also be seen as dangerous. Right? Ideas and persons and institutions that threaten our core values, when we see those, they make us nervous. Right? When the political party that has the opposite beliefs as mine comes into power, what do I get? I get a little nervous. I'm a little worried. Right? Say what you will about first century Christianity, but it was anything but dull and boring. Now, skip forward 2,000 years, 2,020 years. And church life was turned upside down and on its head during 2020, right? There were lockdowns. Attendance at churches dwindled. And then as things started to open up again, people, they didn't come back. They learned to live without the community, without church. And then they realized they could live without church. And they did. Church was too normal. It was suddenly in competition with everything else that was going on, that was coming back online. And so it faded into the background of their lives. And every now and again, these people felt, maybe some nostalgia and a twinge of guilt and a little nag that said, maybe you should go back. But for many, it was too far removed. That minor pang wasn't enough to get them to go out again, back to the church, to the community of Christ. And to get to the heart of why, I want to look at the contrast between modern Western American Christianity and the Jesus communities of the first century. When it comes to the Jesus communities of the first century, you could not imagine a bigger difference from what we have today, right? The first Christians were weird. And I'm not talking about their clothing, right? I'm not talking about their music preferences. I'm not talking about their hobbies, political parties. When I say they were weird or strange, I'm talking about deviation from the cultural norms and deviation from society's expectations that they had for them, for how things in religion ought to be done, especially when it comes to religious functions there. We have to remember, in the Roman era, almost everybody was religious. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but the Christians were as backwards and as odd as you could be. Let's look at our first verse this morning that I want to tie in with this, because really, this is an extended introduction to the book of 1 Peter that I'm doing here. 1 Peter chapter 4. And let's read verses 3 through 4. For the time already past is sufficient for you, or for the time has already passed was sufficient for you to do what the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality. Wait, am I in the right spot here? 1 Peter 4, verse 3 through 4. It's a different version. That's what the deal is. Let me read what's on the board so everybody can follow along. For the time has passed was sufficient for you to do what the non-Christians desire. You lived then in debauchery and evil desires and drunkenness, carousing, drinking bouts, and wanton idolatries. So they were astonished when you do not rush with them into the same flood of wickedness, and so they vilify you. This is why I chose today's lesson to be this sort of introduction, instead of jumping right into 1 Peter. We need to know the context that these things were written under, so we can gain a deeper understanding of the message that Peter was preaching. He says they were astonished when you did not rush with them into the same flood of wickedness. You see, Roman religion had nothing to do with morals. You just went and appeased the gods over here and did this over here, and you were good. You could literally go and kill and murder and do whatever you want, and as long as you did the right things over here, you were good. Roman religion was not about morality. Christianity was the opposite. It was holiness. It was morality focused. And so in 1 Peter, we find a similar affirmation where belief in the invisible God is this true mark of faith. You see, the Romans, they believed in their gods too. But that wasn't who they were. All they had to do was go give the sacrifices. 1 Peter, in the beginning of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, he starts off, and though you haven't seen him, you love him, and even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. What this tells us is that the early Christians emphasized faith. Faith in something that they could not see. And they emphasized a deep devotion, a deep love to something that the Romans were very familiar with. Emphasized a deep devotion to God. But this was a God like no other. And it was because those Christians did those sorts of things. For those reasons, the Christians were going against the grain of common religious thought of the day, of practices, common practices, of the common dynamics of the situation of their time. And so the Romans argued about gods, not over personal beliefs, but over what they thought was true of the gods. Right? They didn't even have a foundational text that they could go back to. But Christians took their views to a whole nother level. They were believing things that seemed absurd to the Romans, things that seemed disturbing, even impossible. And that's why the Christians were originally referred to themselves, that's why Christians originally called themselves believers. Christians was not like a popular title in the first 100 years. They called themselves believers. Well, the Romans believed in a lot of things. But the point was that they were believers in the one true God. And so today we take for granted that all of religion is about faith, that religion is about belief. We take that for granted. We have faith statements on our websites. We have faith traditions. We have interfaith dialogues. We have all these things. But in the ancient world, there wasn't a natural association between religion and faith. It's very similar to the juxtaposition that we have in our own society today when we talk about faith and science, how they're somehow opposed to each other in some people's minds. That's a modern phenomenon. That's in the last 100 years phenomenon. That was not one that was given in the first century. So, let's talk about how Christianity was distinctive, how they were different. Roman religion had priests. And in fact, there was this, quick rabbit trail, there was this one story that there were at least 4 people for every ritual assigned. There was the person who checked to make sure they were doing the ritual correct. There was the person who did the ritual. There was the person who, after the ritual was done, made sure it was done correctly. And then there was a person who was there to control the crowds, to make sure there was silence or whatever needed to happen for every single ritual that happened. And so the priests of the Roman religion weren't chosen because they were pious and knew everything. Do you see what happens there? What happens in our story that they needed 4 people? They were experts in performing the ritual. It needed to be done perfectly. So they had 4 people to make sure, right? The Romans were masters. They had to be masters because of the way they believed. They had to be masters of these religious arts so that they could maintain what they called the Pax Deorum. Pax Deorum, which is peace with the gods. Pax meaning peace. Deo is God. Peace with the gods. Pax Deorum. And it was really a lot like being a professional bomb disposal expert, right? It really doesn't matter what you believe about government, what you believe about law enforcement, or justice when you're the bomb disposal guy, right? None of those things matter. What matters? It matters that you're good at diffusing the bomb, right? And that's how they saw their religion. You needed specialists who could properly communicate and appease these gods to make them happy, because if they're not, the bomb was going to go off if you did it wrong. But these Christians, they didn't have priests. And it's hard for us today to wrap our minds around how odd and dangerous that would seem to the Romans. In one sense, the Christians, they didn't have priests who mediated their worship with God, right? But in another sense, they thought of themselves as a whole priesthood, a priest people, right? 1 Peter chapter 2. You yourself are living stones. You yourselves are living stones being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. In 1 Peter, Christians are described as those individual stones, right? That come together and they're forming a spiritual house, or this group of people who come together, who form this holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to Jesus Christ, right? And also, if you skip down to verse 9 in chapter 2 there, he also talks about that. And very similar in the book of Revelation. There's this vision for the church, as the church being this kingdom of priests who live and serve God in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 6 and chapter 5 and verse 10. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's move on to the worship practices of the early Christians, because Christianity was a religion of the heart, and that couldn't be said of what the Romans did. We talked about baptism this morning in the class, right? Paul refers to baptism as the identification with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. The burial and death of Christ is going into the water, and of Christ's resurrection and glory of coming up out of the water, where or by that action that this person now, this believer now has a new life. If you want to look that up, that's Romans chapter 6 that I'm talking about. Romans chapter 6, starting in verse 3. Or do you not know that those of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, in order that as Christ was raised from the dead, the glory of the Father, so too we might walk in newness of life. We can be a new creation. That's what 2 Corinthians talks about. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. This believer now has a new life. This is a unifying ritual where Christians become one with the Spirit of God. Right? But we can also see how baptism is also this sort of consecration of this believer as a priest. It's giving them direct access to God, because that's what priests do, right? They directly talk with God. But they're not a mediator for somebody else. They're a mediator for themselves. There's no mediators anymore between them and God. There's no barriers. There's no go-betweens. There's no red tape that they have to go around. Paul tells the Corinthians there in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 11 that you were washed, you were consecrated, you were made right with God in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. That almost feels like the kind of declaration that might happen at baptism when somebody's baptized. That purification that happens at baptism sets each Christian apart as holy before God, consecrated for divine service. And for Christians, right, it was not just a few people who knew the secret code, right? It was everybody is supposed to be consecrated. It's not a select few anymore. It's for everybody to be a priest and to become a priesthood. Their whole life was a sacrifice, whereas Romans frequently compartmentalized the religious to festivals and appeasing the gods. Christianity viewed this moral imperative as a whole life sacrifice. When we use the language of worship practices, when we talk about Christian tradition, right? It's natural to talk about hymn singing, right? And praying and doing those sorts of things. But the heart of Christian worship, if we look at Romans chapter 12, Paul says this, to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. And that is your spiritual worship, Paul says. Paul says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing, man, that sounds familiar, renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what the will of God is, what is acceptable and perfect. And that idea goes way above the expectations of what Roman religion was. Christianity was weird because of that. Roman people recognized that the broader society should be respectful to the gods in order to, so that we could have that Pax Deorum, right? But to become living sacrifices would be a paradox for them. That was difficult to grasp, because a sacrifice was something you chopped its head off and then gave it to the gods and they were happy and that was the end of it. You did your duty. There's nothing else you can do. But when we talk about Romans chapter 12 there, what Paul says, it reinforces the Christian and their baptism, this consecration to the Lord, to God, where the believers are like both priests and sacrifices. We are sacrificing ourselves to God, giving up the old person, putting on the new person, right? There's nothing left over. There's no in between. Hebrews talks about the same thing in Hebrews chapter 13, when it says that we need to be offering sacrifices that are pleasing to God. He's not talking about doves or goats or sheep, right? Paul thanks the Philippians for their sacrifices of their gifts to him, of aid when he needed it the most, of the support that they gave him when he was in prison. And he calls those gifts a fragrant offering. That's Philippians chapter 4, verse 18. He calls them a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. Right? And those are just some tangible examples that I wanted to give of what it meant to be a living sacrifice. To give to others is to offer to the Lord, especially if you're helping a member of the household of God, a member of the church. And as the church formed, according to the book of Acts, Christians made this conscious decision to devote themselves to the apostles' teachings and to Christian fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayers. Acts chapter 2 and verse 42. And as those needs arose in the community, the 12, the apostles, appointed leaders to distribute that food so that the apostles could focus on what? Do we remember? prayer. Acts chapter 6, verse 4. And so Paul commands the Thessalonians to pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And so the worship practice of prayer made these Christians weird, because you didn't pray. I mean, you might pray at home if you were a Roman. You might have your little shrine and go say a little prayer and light a candle or something. But it wasn't something that they did very commonly. Romans looked at Jews and Christians especially with suspicion. Let me back up. The Romans sort of understood the Jews. Yeah, they were weird because they had one God, but they understood them. They had priests. There was a temple. They went and did things in the temple. Looked very familiar, right? Christians were not that way. And once they understood that Christians were different than Jews, that's where the Christians then got themselves in trouble. Because the Romans looked at the Christians with suspicion, in part because of their obsession over prayer. And Christians took this to a whole nother level. And the Romans would have wondered, how can you pray without ceasing? Don't you have other things to do in your life? That sound familiar? Maybe we say those things, right? When we're busy and have busy things to do in our life. I got some other things I got to do. I can't spend time in prayer right now. Right? I think the idea behind the Christian passion for prayer here is infusing our life with the presence of God, right? The Romans believed that the gods could appear anytime they wanted to, but under normal circumstances, you went to the hot spot where the god was, right? Like a temple. And you picked up the telephone and connected with them through this priest who did the rituals and the formal prayers. And so the early Christians came to see the divine presence of God in a different way. Christians literally couldn't go anywhere so that they were closer to the presence of God, right? Because where was the presence of God? It was inside of them. They believed that God's Spirit, if they were baptized, lived within them. And there was this longing to know God in this deeper way that could only happen when the gospel work had been done in their hearts. And each person had this equal and unhindered access to God at all times. And so for Christians, that was priest-like privileges in their life. So let's wrap this up, because I've been bloviating for quite a while here. The first century Christians were weird. There's no getting around the fact that Christians deviated from the common and public Roman religion. A Roman visiting a Christian assembly would have found a lot of things very confusing going on. Where are the priests? Where are the sacrifices? Who is this Jesus? Why are there no cult statues around? Right? What is this new scripture? By the way, anything new in the Roman world was bad, because the Roman Empire had been around for 1,000 years. Right? Anything new is bad. So these new scriptures that we're seeing Paul write and the other apostles write, they would have felt discomfort. First century Christians were weird. First century Christians were dangerous. Because one person's weird is another person's dangerous. Right? Rome tolerated a lot of weird stuff. They did. Foreign cults were permitted to a certain extent. They were monitored, and certain things were allowed and weren't. But Christian religion violated so many religious norms that it was inevitable that many people would consider it a threat to their very well-being in their life. Christians were weird, they were dangerous, and the third point I want to make especially is that they were compelling. Christians were compelling. And yet, because of all those things, and yet, we know that Christianity drew interests and it grew exponentially. Why did that happen? I would point out that one of the major reasons that it happened is because of the people, because of the Christians themselves. in the first century, a Roman who encountered a Christian, or a Roman who was going to encounter Jesus, was always going to happen through a small community of Christians. And this new Jesus community was compelling because of their declaration that this one true God loves you and cares for you, and that you ought to honor him and love him back, not out of fear that he's standing over you with a big stick, or not out of fear that he just killed his brother and now he's coming after you. That's what the Roman gods were all about, right? This was exactly backwards from Roman religion, the fact that God cares and loves us. Roman religion taught honor first, and then maybe the gods would be appeased, right? The Romans didn't typically connect love of people with the gods. And so for them to consider true and genuine love and compassion, for them to consider that as coming from above, that was something to wonder about. And that's something that we need to portray into the world today, because this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Where did we start off? What was the example that I gave at the beginning? The coconut water, right? What color is the coconut water? It's only white because of the things that have been added to it. So what color is our Christianity? Some manufacturers want to sell us a clear drink because it offers the impression of refreshment and purity, right? And then there are people who are a little weird who are okay with pink coconut water, like us. The lesson this morning has been my attempt to show the context of early Christianity within their own religious and social and cultural reality. There is no getting around that the early Christians were different. They were unexpected in their actions. They were off-putting to some, but they were attractive and compelling to others. And that's how we need to be living our life. Not attracting people with the chemicals of the world, the preservatives of the world, but with the truth, the pink coconut water. Right? We need to be using the truth of the gospel to tell them about how much God loves them, so much so that he gave his only son so that they didn't have to live a life that was full of murder and death and destruction, right? The first Jesus followers were okay with being different. They were okay with deviating from the status quo. They were okay with following Jesus wherever he went. And we need to be okay with that too. There is a need for us today in the modern church to pick up a bottle of our own religion and look at it and say, hey, that looks different, but that's good. That's refreshing. That's the truth. And sometimes that looks weird to the world, but it can also be compelling. That's the lesson for this morning. Next week, I can't promise we're going to start 1 Peter next week. I might do another lesson on Christianity in the first century. But that's the lesson for this morning. If anyone has any needs, if you have needs the water of baptism, if you need to be added to the church, if you need to put off the old person and put on the new person and come up out of the water a new person, that new person, we can help you with that this morning if you come and let us know.